The tide had fallen back, leaving a wide stretch of damp sand marked with scattered shells and seaweed. In the middle of it lay a seal pup, its small body pressed against the cold surface. Its fur, pale and patchy from birth, clung wet and matted, giving it little warmth against the wind that swept across the beach. Every so often, the pup lifted its head and released a thin cry, the sound barely rising above the rush of waves. The ocean answered only with its endless rhythm, offering no reply. The pup's sides quivered with shallow breaths, its strength already waning. It shifted its flippers clumsily, pushing against the sand in an effort to rise, but the movements brought no progress. Instead, its body slid weakly back into place, exhaustion overtaking each attempt. Salt from the sea air stung its eyes, and still it turned toward the horizon, straining as if searching for a shape that never appeared. Hours passed, marked only by the slow stretch of shadows across the beach. The cries continued, thinner now, the sound carrying a weary persistence. Gulls circled above but kept their distance, their harsh calls cutting against the softer, desperate voice of the pup. The beach, otherwise empty, felt achingly vast around the fragile animal. This was not unusual for seals, for mothers sometimes left their young for stretches of time while hunting at sea. Yet the stillness here, the absence of any adult returning, deepened the silence into something heavier. The pup had been calling since morning, its small form curled closer to the ground now, shivering from both chill and strain. The texture of the sand darkened beneath it, where its body pressed into the dampness. Occasionally, the pup lifted its nose, scenting the air, a faint instinct guiding it toward the sea. But its flippers trembled when it tried to move, and it lacked the strength to drag itself back to the water. The distance between its resting place and the tide line was no more than a few yards, yet it might as well have been miles. There was a rawness to its voice, each cry sharper than the last but stretched thin with fatigue. The rhythm faltered, leaving longer pauses of silence between each attempt. Its eyes, dark and wide, blinked slowly as though the effort of keeping them open grew heavier with every minute. The sun dipped lower, softening the light across the sand, turning the sea to glassy silver where the waves broke. Still, the pup remained alone. The horizon, endless and unbroken, offered no hint of a mother's return. The beach felt suspended in that waiting, an expanse of soundless watching broken only by the thin cry of the stranded young one. As the tide began to creep back in, the water reached closer, foaming at the edges of the beach, carrying the smell of salt and kelp. The pup turned again toward the waves, a flicker of instinct stirring. But the effort was beyond its body. Instead, it pressed its face to the sand, its cry lifting once more, carried by the wind into the vast quiet. The beach listened, the ocean kept its distance, and the young seal waited still. The cries had not faded. By the time the first volunteers reached the beach, the sound was already familiar, a thin, trembling call carried over the tide. They stopped at a distance, careful not to disturb the pup's fragile stillness. The animal's body, small against the wide stretch of sand, lifted its head every few minutes and gave voice again, the sound rising and falling like a fragile thread against the steady backdrop of waves. The volunteers stood quietly, letting the rhythm of the cries guide their patience. They knew to wait. Seal mothers sometimes left their young for hours while hunting, returning only when the tide allowed. To approach too soon risked breaking the bond, forcing separation rather than offering help. So they kept their distance, their presence marked only by stillness, by quiet observation, by trust in time. The pup's body language told its own story. Its sides shuddered with each breath, and its flippers twitched when it tried to shift against the damp sand. It did not rise, only pushed slightly forward before sliding back again, as if the weight of the world pressed too heavily upon its frame. The calls came softer now, though no less urgent, each one followed by a pause that seemed longer than the last. The beach carried those sounds far, echoing against dunes and vanishing into the sea's low roar. Minutes folded into an hour. The volunteers scanned the horizon constantly, searching for any sign of a larger shape breaking the line of waves. A dark back, a sleek head, anything that could mean the mother's return. But the sea remained unbroken, its surface rolling steadily, indifferent to the small voice crying out upon the sand. One of the volunteers shifted, stepping slowly closer, then stopped again. "Still no one," he murmured, his words barely more than breath. The others nodded, their silence answering with the same weight. They knew the moment that voice would carry, when the decision to wait might need to give way to action. The pup blinked heavily, eyelids closing longer each time, only to be lifted again with effort. A faint rasp colored its call now, less sharp, more fragile, as though each sound scraped from the limits of its strength. The volunteers exchanged quiet looks, torn between knowledge and instinct. They were taught to let nature choose, to wait for the bond of mother and pup to rejoin. But the beach remained empty, the tide stretching closer without bringing the figure they longed to see. Still, they held their distance. The ocean had its rhythm, and sometimes patience was the greatest act of care. They let the waves roll in, let the wind shift across the sand, and listened as the pup's voice carried through the fading light. Each cry hung in the air a moment longer before dissolving into silence, only to be replaced by another, soft but insistent. As the sun lowered, painting the horizon in pale amber, the decision pressed heavier on them. The pup's small frame trembled more often now, its body curling tighter to conserve what warmth remained. Its head lifted weakly, one last call rising against the tide before it lowered again, eyes closing as though in surrender. The volunteers watched with quiet resolve, the stillness of their stance broken only by the pull of compassion waiting to guide them forward. The shoreline remained empty. The ocean gave no answer. Only the lingering cry of the pup held the space between. The pup's cries had thinned into faint, irregular sounds, no longer carrying with the same strength across the shore. What had begun as a steady call of need now came in shorter bursts, fragile and fading. The little body shifted only in small movements, flippers dragging gently against the sand, as if even the effort of turning was too much to hold. The tide rolled in and out with its endless rhythm, but it brought no mother back to the beach. The silence between each cry grew longer, weighted with exhaustion, until the team watching from a distance began to move. They had waited for hours, giving the sea its chance, hoping a darker shape might appear in the rolling blue to claim the young. But none came. Each volunteer carried the quiet recognition that without care, the pup's strength would soon be gone. They began to step forward, their boots pressing softly into the damp earth, their bodies bent with caution, as though their stillness and pace could protect the fragile trust that might form. One of them carried a thick cloth folded over their arm, the fabric clean and dry, prepared for the small body it would hold. The pup lifted its head as they neared. Its dark eyes, wide and wet with salt, seemed to waver with uncertainty, not from knowing intent, but from the instinctive tremor of being approached. Its cries broke again high and thin, then collapsed back into the hush of the wind. The flippers stirred, pushing weakly against the sand, but the movement held no strength to flee. The small chest rose and fell, shallow, almost trembling with the rhythm of effort. The team knelt, lowering their presence until they met the ground at the pup's level. One hand extended, steady, pausing in the space between skin and fur, waiting before closing the distance. The pup did not lash out, only tilted slightly, a shiver rippling through its whiskers as the hand settled gently against its damp coat. "Easy now," one voice whispered, quiet as the surf. The words were less for meaning than for tone, a thread of calm placed into the air. With practiced care, two sets of hands unfolded the cloth, sliding it beneath the pup's body. The movement was slow, deliberate, allowing each shift to follow the rhythm of the tide, never abrupt, never sharp. The pup's head lifted once, a soft, throaty sound escaping, then dropped back as fatigue overcame the effort. Its body, no heavier than a large dog, sagged into the fabric, shoulders slack, breaths shallow but present. The volunteers gathered the edges of the cloth, lifting in unison, their arms forming a cradle around the young seal. The pup's fur glistened, damp from the sea air, its small frame curled naturally, as though surrendering to the security of being held. One of the men adjusted his grip, speaking low. "That's it. Little one." Again, it was not the content, but the softness that carried, folding into the moment with gentleness. The group rose carefully, shifting their weight against the soft ground, mindful of balance, mindful of the small life wrapped in their arms. The pup gave one last cry, weaker than before, but its nose flared at the smell of salt carried by the breeze, the instinctive pull of ocean never far from its body. In the quiet between wind and waves, the decision had been made, not rushed, not forced, but chosen with respect. The pup, wrapped and held steady, no longer struggled. Its eyes closed briefly, its chest moving faintly with the effort of each breath. The volunteers looked toward the sea, the path ahead clear. What lay before them was not yet release, not yet reunion, but the first step of carrying the young seal back to where it belonged. The tide whispered against the sand, marking the shoreline with its steady promise. And in their arms, the pup rested, carried now with the weight of hope and care. The shoreline stretched long and pale, damp sand darkening beneath the tide's reach. The volunteers carried the small seal pup carefully, each step placed with steady rhythm, their arms forming a cradle of cloth and quiet strength. The pup's weight pressed lightly against them, but the weight of the moment felt heavier, as though the ocean itself had placed its trust in their care. The group moved in silence, except for the shifting whisper of fabric and the soft, shallow sounds of the animal they held. Against the cloth, the pup stirred faintly. Its head lifted, no longer sagging with complete exhaustion, but moving with fragile effort toward the scent carried by the breeze. Its nostrils widened, drawing in the familiar salt, the deep memory of where it belonged. The cries that once echoed sharp and desperate now came softer, almost broken into hums, as if each sound tested the closeness of the sea. The pup blinked slowly, its dark eyes catching faint light, then closed again, conserving what little strength remained. The volunteers adjusted their hold, never hurried, their steps following the rhythm of waves breaking ahead. The sand shifted underfoot, soft and uneven, yet they pressed forward in quiet unison. One of them leaned slightly to glance at the pup's face, watching for any sign of distress. Seeing only a faint rise and fall of the chest, he exhaled, whispering low, "Almost there, little one." The words faded quickly into the wind, spoken less to be heard than to soothe the moment. As they neared the waterline, the air grew heavier with spray, the sound of waves rolling over themselves filling the silence. The pup reacted, turning its head again, nose lifted higher, whiskers trembling as droplets touched its fur. A small sound escaped its throat, not the desperate call of before, but something softer, as though answering the nearness of what it sought. Its flippers twitched within the folds of the cloth, weak, but stirred by instinct, echoing the motions of swimming, though still too frail to hold such strength. The group slowed their pace, not from hesitation, but from reverence. Each step closer to the tide marked a shift, a narrowing of the distance between land and sea, between the struggle of isolation and the hope of reunion. The cloth was adjusted once more, edges tightened, so the pup remained secure as the earth beneath them grew wetter, colder. Dark streaks of kelp lay scattered, and gulls circled distantly, their calls carried by the wind. Yet none of it broke the quiet focus of those holding the small life. The pup's head rested briefly against the arm of the one carrying it, eyes half-lidded, before lifting again toward the surf. Its breaths deepened with the scent of salt, the sound of crashing waves stirring something buried in instinct. The volunteers could feel its faint shift in weight, as if the ocean itself was calling its body to lean forward, urging it closer. Their grip remained steady, their arms unshaken, but their pace slowed again, carrying the moment with care. The tide lapped at their boots as they reached the line where sand and sea intertwined. Here, the pup let out one more cry, higher than the softer sounds before, its head tilting outward, nose pointing straight into the rolling mist. It was not strong, but it carried, meeting the rush of the waves as if placing its own call back into the endless blue. The volunteers paused, standing still at the edge, water washing cool around their ankles. The pup held firmly but tenderly in their arms. The cries subsided once more, replaced by shallow breaths and the stillness of waiting. Around them, the sea stretched wide, timeless and alive, its surface shifting in quiet invitation. In the hush of that moment, the small seal rested, its fragile body pressed safely against human arms, the ocean drawing nearer with each turn of the tide. The volunteers lowered themselves slowly at the water's edge, boots sinking into wet sand, arms tightening around the small bundle of cloth one last time. The pup stirred faintly, whiskers brushing against the salt air, its flippers shifting with weak but determined movements. Its nose lifted higher than before, breathing deep, pulling in the scent of the sea as if memory alone was guiding it forward. The waves reached for it in gentle laps, each surge curling around ankles and fabric, as though the ocean itself leaned in to welcome its young back home. With steady hands, they loosened the cloth. The pup slipped free, its fur immediately darkening as the tide reached over its small body. At first it lingered, half draped against the retreating sand, eyes open wide in hesitation. Then, with a fragile effort, it pushed forward, flippers pressing against the water's pull. The sound that came next was faint, a thin cry carried into the wind, meeting the endless roll of the surf. The volunteers stood still, silent, their presence soft behind the pup's small frame. None reached out again, though instinct tempted them to shield, to hold on. Instead, they allowed the water to carry the young seal further, inch by inch, until its body floated lightly within the foam. Its head rose once, then dipped again, as if surrendering to the embrace of the tide. Moments stretched, fragile and uncertain, broken only by the rhythm of the ocean. The pup paddled forward clumsily, driven by instinct rather than strength, each movement small against the immensity of the sea. And then, from beyond the swells, a shape began to surface, larger, steady, moving with intent. The smooth arc of a back cut the water, followed by the glint of a head lifting into air. A low, resonant call carried across the distance, a sound deeper and fuller than the pup's cry, but unmistakably connected. The pup answered at once, its weak voice rising high against the roar of waves. It turned, shifting its body toward the sound, its strokes no longer hesitant but driven, though still unsteady. The mother moved closer, her sleek form parting the water with ease. Another call vibrated low, steady, and this time the pup's cry came shorter, urgent, as though each sound pulled the two nearer still. Within moments, the gap between them closed. The mother reached her young, circling once, brushing her body gently against the pup's side. The pup pressed close, its head lifting, flippers beating weakly against the water in recognition. No words were needed, only the touch of bodies meeting after long absence, the answering of call with call. On shore, the volunteers remained in silence. Their arms hung loose at their sides, cloth heavy and wet in their hands. None stepped forward, none spoke loudly. They only watched as the reunion unfolded, as the sea held both mother and pup together, their movements easing into unison. One volunteer whispered, so low it was nearly lost beneath the waves, "She's home now." The tide pulled higher, foam rushing up the sand, erasing the footprints that had carried the pup down to the shore. The volunteers stepped back, boots sinking deeper, their figures retreating quietly from the edge. They did not linger long, for the moment was not theirs to hold. Farther out, the two seals drifted side by side, the mother guiding her young into deeper water, the pup pressing close, no longer alone. The cries that once cut through the silence of the beach were gone now, replaced by the steady rhythm of sea and breath. The waves rolled on, silver under the fading light, carrying mother and pup back into the vastness. On the sand, the wind moved across the shore, whispering over smooth stretches where footprints had been, leaving only the quiet trace of salt and sea.